So hey, thank you guys for joining us here. It's 12 o'clock noon, so 12:03 noon here on the Eastern Seaboard. So we're going to get started. But this is the first part of a labor management 4-week program where we're going to cover retaining, finding employees, how to hire them, some things you need to consider for the farm, health insurance, the legal part of it, retirement planning. So this is just the first part of this section or first part of this multi-week course. So I'm going to talk to you guys about hiring and retaining employees and what you should do and how you should manage employees on the farm. But the first thing we're going to kind of go through, and Maria and Paul chime in with anything else about what we're going to be accomplishing in the next 4 weeks. I don't know if I missed anything particular, or I must have done a really good job describing it. So, um,
So hi, everyone. Welcome to be for welcome. Glad you're here. And I'm Maria Pepitas, colleague with Nate. And yeah, we've been working hard on this resource and this series of programs. So we look forward to your feedback and your participation. So thanks.
As I say, I'm Paul Geringer. I'm at the University of Maryland, and I'll be talking next week on it about the employee handbook, or yeah, a handbook, I guess is what we're calling it.
And Maria and I are with the University of Delaware. So this is a collaboration between University of Maryland and University of Delaware. So I don't know if everybody's in this group is resides within those two states, but matter of fact, actually, if you get a chance, type in your name, where you're from, and what kind of organization you're representing, whether you're a producer or nonprofit or whatever it might be. If you guys don't mind putting that in the chat for us, we're just kind of curious who signed up for this 4-week program. But the first thing we're going to go through today is I want to show you guys can you guys all see this? This is an employer's guide and workbook. So it's a guide that you could go ahead and you can use it as a supplemental resource when you're doing a farm business plan. And we developed this to be user friendly because hiring and retaining employees, there's a lot of different avenues out there that you can go and a lot of different things. So we describe different aspects of how you find an employee and how you maintain an employee working on the farm, and then give you sections where you can type in your own information. So, this project was funded from USDA and NEFA. We have that in there, the acknowledgement. But here are the different sections. So, to hire, to not to hire, writing a job description, offering benefits to employees, health insurance for farm employees, retirement savings, interviewing, evaluating selection of candidates once you're out there hiring in the workforce, orientation and training of employees, communicating with employees. Employee communication is pretty critical. We'll talk a little bit about that today. How to keep employees motivated, periodic annual review of personnel, terminating employees, and keeping records. So it's a pretty broad workbook. Not going to go into it 100% detail today. If you would like, we can mail all these materials, this packet, and some of the other materials that are going to be discussed in the later weeks. We can mail them to you on a flash drive and send them to your house. So at the end of the project, if you want that, let us know. We have the postage and the funds to do that for you. So like here's the first example: to hire, to not to hire. So we have an explanation on this, and some considerations for your own individual operation, and then some kind of questions to follow up with, that you should consider for your own operation. We're going to discuss actually this section today a little bit in my PowerPoint. But pretty easy workbook to use. We do have some additional resources. So if you're interested in learning more for each section, we have those. That's always nice to have if you want to delve into some more learning. But yeah, that's the workbook. I'm gonna look into the chat real quick and see where we're from. So we have somebody, Saint Indigos. I hope I'm saying that right. Marilyn, you're a producer. Brooke. Um, Lavelle's from Kansas, you're a producer, so all the way out in Kansas. Um, Kristen Redding, you work with, you work with Paul. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm just kidding. Uh, Abby is with the Progressive Cattle Magazine. I think, Abby, where did you say you were located? You had said something earlier.
Yeah, I was originally in Oklahoma, but I'm based out of Idaho now.
Okay.
Yep.
Alrighty. So we're gonna dive in, we're gonna dive in here and, go into our presentation. Stop share. All right. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about hiring and managing employees on the farm. And, farm labor is really hard to find and retain. And, labor in general across the US is hard, but it's really difficult for farmers, in particular, because a lot of the labor that's available is often found in rural communities, and a lot of people move out of rural communities. And since COVID, it's really made this difficult. So I think us doing this project, we have some pretty good timing here, to try to help producers, think about hiring labor, managing labor on their farm, and finding employees that want to stick around. So we're going to focus on a couple core things today. These are in that employer workbook, but determining when to hire, writing a job description, tax considerations. When you hire a new employee, how's that going to affect the farm's taxes? Orientation and employee training, and then employer communication. So that's what we're going to cover today. And feel free to chime in at any time. I allotted about 15 minutes at the end of today to just have discussion or questions. But if you want me to dive into something a little bit deeper, please let me know. So farms, there's some key indicators on a farming business when additional labor is needed. And some of those key indicators, the first one is decreasing levels of production and output. So if you're saying that, you're not producing as many different crops, you're not yielding what you should do, or let's say if you're a cattle operation, you're not able to do the hay work as often as you should. You can't take things to market as much. If you're seeing that, it is possible that you have a labor shortage or a labor issue on your farm. There's a lot of research out there that has proven that, insufficient farm labor is a major issue nationwide, especially for farms, and it's gotten worse since COVID. So we're seeing more and more of this, as I mentioned earlier. Another sign that you might have a labor problem is if your current employees cannot, effectively complete tasks, or if the tasks are, when they're being completed, they're not being completed to the expectations. So if they're leaving something out, when they do complete a task, you might have a problem. Maybe it's because they don't have enough time to complete the task. If your employees are always calling in sick, from illness or stress, it might be too much. They might be working too long, and they might be exposed to, conditions that are outside their control. So that's another sign that the farm might have a labor shortage or a labor need. If you, as the operator of the farm, if you continually find yourself, spending time on tasks that do not generate any kind of sales revenue for the operation, that's another sign that, maybe you have a labor shortage or a labor need on the farm. I know a lot of times with farmers, they'll end up, when they don't have enough people working there, they end up spending a lot more time in the office doing tasks that do not generate revenue, or fixing equipment. We see that a lot here on the Eastern Shore, where, it would be nice to have a mechanic on staff, but they end up having to spend more time in a shop, fixing equipment or doing something else that's not generating revenue. So I kind of mentioned that, but when a farm has insufficient labor, the ability to generate revenue is diminished. And that's really the key sign that it's time for me to go out and hire a new employee, or I have a labor situation going on where I need some more people on the farm. So if you're seeing sales not materializing where they should be, that's typically the biggest sign that we have a labor problem. So evaluating the labor need, you know, I'm gonna move this little thing over here. It's bothering me, my little gallery view of all of us. So hiring for small businesses, you know, such as farming operations, can have a positive and a negative impact on the farm. So when you bring on somebody, you're paying them, you know, a wage. So that's going to impact your cash flow. So you need to make sure that when you hire a new employee, that it's at the right time. If you hire somebody too early, it's going to really diminish your cash flow. If you hire somebody too late, then you've already done some damage to the operation as far as productivity and output capacity goes. So you need to make sure that when you do make the decision to hire an employee, it's at the right time. It's really imperative to make sure that your new employee is coming in when you need them. You know, farming is also, I can't stress this enough, but farming can be a very seasonal business. So sometimes the need for laborers is heavier in the summer months when things are growing, versus in you know the winter or you know possibly the fall or the spring, depending on what's being grown on the farm. So it's really important to kind of go ahead and set aside, you know, when do I need additional help on the farm? When is that labor need most needed here, and how do I go ahead and I address that? So the biggest thing to ask, you know, once you kind of think it would be nice to have additional labor on the farm, you need to ask yourself, you know, can the farming operation currently sustain a new employee? And you really want to take a look at like your production budgets for different enterprises. You know, you know, I make a lot of enterprise budgets. University of Maryland does too. All the land-grant universities have different enterprise budgets. And a lot of farmers use that. They may not use the Excel versions that we publish at the institutions, but they may have like an old school, you know, pen and pencil where they're writing it out and they're trying to see what, you know, the break-even prices of products that they sell. And then they're making a separate line item for, you know, labor. So it's really important to go ahead and look at all the different budgets that you have, all different production budgets on the farm and see, you know, how much, you know, what would your final sales, how would they be impacted if you do bring in new labor? And you want to do that across the board. And it's not just on the production side, but you want to take a look at the cash flow statements of the farm and kind of see, you know, if this new person is coming in and providing, you know, mechanical expertise or is providing, you know, administrative duties, how are they impacting the farm's cash flow statements? The other thing too is a lot of times, you know, new employee in the farm is needed, that they need to bring a certain skill set into the operation. So here on the Eastern Shore, we see a lot of farmers hire people that have CDLs or the ability to transport and haul grain, you know, commercial driver's license. If you need to pay a new employee to go out and get that training, you know, that's an additional expense you need to consider for the operation. And if that's the case, can the operation cover that expense? And what's the return for the payoff of, you know, paying that for that training? You know, how long is it going to take for the operation to receive the benefit of doing that and investing in that employee? It's really important to sit down and kind of run through these numbers before you even go out and decide, you know, I'm going to bring somebody into the operation. You really need to make sure that the operations, you know, the operation is still profitable if they go out and hire somebody. Now, really the ideal situation is if I bring somebody into the farm, I've determined that I have a labor shortage. I need somebody with certain skill sets on the farm. Really, the main driver for hiring somebody on the farm should be to generate additional revenue to what I'm generating now. That should be my primary goal as a producer. I would hope that, you know, bringing somebody on the farm is going to make us more profitable, but really we need to see an increase in sales revenue when we bring in somebody on the farm. You know, I mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, high demand for farm labor can be seasonal. I know we have somebody, I think it was Abby who said she's in the cattle industry. You know, cattle labor is probably going to be, you know, throughout the year. Usually, you're married to livestock, so the labor demand for the cattle is gonna be all year. I know here in the Eastern Shore, we have a lot of poultry farmers, with poultry houses. So their labor demand is also throughout the year as well. So it's the demand for farm labor is gonna really vary from farm business to farm business to farm business. So it's really important when you're thinking about labor and how your operation derives sales revenue. You really want to think about, when is my labor, when are the times of the year that I really need labor? And how can I go ahead and find the labor at those times of the year to increase my output to generate additional revenue? Now, sometimes, the labor you need may not actually be somebody to help out with, the farming side of the business. It may actually be somebody with mechanical inclination that can help you work on equipment to make sure that, your things are operating smoothly in the growing season, so they're not having any breakdowns. That alone might be your biggest labor need. Or, another one could be somebody to do administrative duties around tax season. I see a lot of that with producers. A lot of times they need somebody to go ahead and do all the paperwork and work with the accountant because they don't have time to do that. So every operation is different, and it's really going to be up to you to figure out, is this essential to us securing more output and generating more revenue? How does it impact our cash flow statement? That's going to be up to you. The big thing is, even though you might be generating more revenue, are you actually going to be more profitable? You're going to see profitability improve from hiring an additional employee, or you're going to see it decrease. And I'll actually use an example of this. I worked with a producer from the past. They had a nephew on the farm that helped them out. And, a lot of times farms are family businesses. I think 97% of the farms in the US are family-ran operations. That number might have changed. But in this case, they were actually, they really looked at the numbers and what they were, how this employee fit into their farm. And unfortunately for them and this nephew, they were actually more profitable if the nephew was not a full-time employee on the farm, because a lot of the work that he did for that producer was in the summer, but he was paying him throughout the year. So unfortunately, he had to have a hard conversation with them about, hey, you're gonna have to find some additional employment away from the farm. And that's tough, especially when it's a family member. But for that individual producer, his profitability actually increased from asking his nephew to step back and be a part-time employee. So that's just one example of that. Now, in that case, I don't know. And now I'm diving into something completely different, and Paul could chime in at some point, but Paul does a lot of this work, but succession planning, I'm pretty sure his nephew is the one that's going to inherit the operation in the long run. So stepping back and becoming a part-time employee for him, it's fine. It's just, got to find work somewhere else. But hey, the operation is more profitable. So you really need to consider that when you're thinking about, hiring a new employee. So once you figured out that, okay, I have a labor need, I have a labor shortage on the farm, you need to start thinking about finding candidates to fulfill that job need. So the first thing you need to do is write a job description. And, job description, really what it is, I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this, have worked in various places, apply for different jobs. You've probably seen it, all of you in this chat or in this session today have probably seen job descriptions in some shape or form. But a job description explains the duties and responsibilities of the new employee and what they will do every day on the farm. So use job descriptions for different things. The first is recruiting for the position. So the job description, it outlines what is going to happen from day to day for this new employee. And you go ahead and you use that to kind of evaluate candidates for recruiting. It clarifies responsibilities. So, it outlines it to people that are to applicants what they will be doing, and they can kind of gauge if they fit that position or not. It helps you determine pay. So you could use the job description and look at what other similar job descriptions are the salaries that they're offering for similar jobs within your area, and you can kind of establish what the pay rate is. Now, a really good example of this, and sometimes when I see a discrepancy here, is if you're a farm and you're hiring a truck driver. Well, sometimes, commercial drivers, people with CDLs that are driving for a large company around you, they might be able to pay a lot more than you can as a farming operation. So sometimes you do see discrepancies in, the job description and, looking around and seeing, what similar positions are paying when you're determining pay rates. I do want to make a note of that. And then last but not least, the biggest thing is use job descriptions to do performance reviews. So at the end of the year, or quarterly, or however you want to do it, at the end of the growing season, if that's when this person is going to work for you, whatever it might be, you want to go revisit the initial job description that they saw, and then see, did they go ahead, did they fulfill each responsibility in the job description? And hopefully, if you did a really good job in recruiting and hiring, they did. They were perfect. So determining titles, this is one thing, that's really, really important in writing a job description, but I feel is often overlooked. As far as the importance of it, if you will, but the very first step, when you're writing a job description is trying to figure out what the title of the new employee is. So they could be, harvest crew worker. I'm just thinking about farm titles, poultry house manager, grain truck driver, agronomist, if your farm, has one, whatever it might be. So you want to make sure that the title reflects the purpose of the position. So, you don't want to be hiring somebody as a harvest crew manager and then, they're actually going out and trucking or doing something completely different. So it needs to reflect what you're hiring the person to do. The last thing, definitely consider like status issues when determining titles. So like a good example, would be like director of marketing or, harvest crew leader or whatever it might be. Because when you come up with a title like that, one thing on the management side of the farm, that new employee, they might expect a higher wage rate than what you're actually able to pay them on the operation. The other thing too is if you do have other staff that don't have that title, they may be more inclined to leave the operation and find employment somewhere else if they feel that individual employee is getting more because of that title. So it's like senior is another one, leader. There's a lot of different titles out there. Oh. So job duties and responsibilities, these are what you're gonna put in the job description that really outlay the extent and of the time that employees spend on the job. So what do they do on a daily basis? What is it? Do they go out and do they cultivate? Do they spread manure? Do they help, inseminate cattle or livestock? Whatever it is, you want to outline that. And the easiest way, in my opinion, is to create a bulleted list that explicitly outlines the responsibilities for the job. What will they be doing? And, those of us that work for the universities, we're really familiar with this when we do job descriptions here, it has percentages that lists, how much time we spend in research or extension or whatever it might be. You can actually use the same strategy for creating a job description for a farming enterprise as well. If you're hiring somebody that you want them to spend most of their time doing mechanical work, making sure machinery is working when it's go time, when you have crops in the field, you may want maybe they'd be a 75%, mechanical responsibilities, 10% admin, whatever it is. But use those percentages in the bulleted list. It definitely can help, writing an effective job description. Each job duty, you definitely want to explain these clearly and concisely. Now, I would also suggest that, if there's other responsibilities, make sure you put that in there. But definitely try not to leave any surprises in, each job duty that you need this new employee to do on the operation. It should be pretty black and white, not just for, finding an effective employee, but also for going ahead and doing a performance review. So to make that performance review easier, make sure that you are, explaining these responsibilities and duties clearly and concisely. I got a little bit of ahead of myself there, but make sure if there's other work that is needed, make sure that you mention this, in the job description as, possibly other non-essential responsibilities. So, if you're gonna use the percentages or you're gonna use the bullet points, maybe, 10% or 5%, whatever it is. But make sure that you list that in there because, farming in itself, there's a lot of different things that can happen. And a lot of times employees, what they're hired to do, they might get pulled away to do something else. If the weather is bad or the market conditions change, whatever it might be. So make sure that you're listing within the job description other non-essential responsibilities. You can actually add a disclaimer to the job description. If that works, that's another alternative to listing other non-essential responsibilities. You can add a disclaimer to the job description to say the list is not comprehensive. And that would also cover perhaps, the employee going to do something else. An effective job description, I think this is the one thing I've tried to stress throughout the presentation today, is one where recruitment is easy to do. You find the ideal candidate, it's not burdensome, but also those performance evaluations at the end of the year are really easy to do. If you already have employees on the farm and you think the performance evaluations are difficult, that job description or the criteria that you're using for the performance evaluations, it may not be effective. So definitely having a good job description is critical. So position qualifications, can't stress this enough, but when you're going out and you're recruiting for the position, you need to make sure that, the qualifications are listed for the job within the description. So if you need somebody with a CDL or, commercial pesticide applicator license, make sure to include that within the job description. So some other examples of qualifications that might be needed, knowledge and skill sets, that could be mechanical, mechanical inclination, commodity crop experience. We're talking about cows. Maybe it's working cattle into head gates or familiarity with like vaccinations or insemination, whatever that might be. It might be something particular to the job that you're hiring for. Education could be another one. Maybe it's all you need this employee to have is a high school diploma. Maybe like they're an agronomist or something, so they need to have, bachelor's in agronomy. So make sure that you list that there. Licenses, I keep going back to that commercial driver's license. If that's needed, list that there. Pesticide applicators license. Here in the Eastern Shore, we have to do nutrient management plans. So if you need to hire somebody for that, include that there. Then any experience. A lot of times I'll see like on like Craigslist or different places. I don't know why, but Craigslist seems to be a place a lot of farmers try to find help on, like farmhand or whatever. But they always list, 6 years of experience or 5 years or whatever it is. So make sure you list that within the job description. Now, I'm not sure if Craigslist is the greatest place to find farm employment. I just feel like farmers, they've gotten used to buying machinery and stuff on there. So I'm kind of interested when we're done, if anybody wants to share any other places they've seen, farm labor advertisements posted outside of Craigslist. I'm kind of interested to hear about that. I don't know if rural America still uses that, but yeah. But work conditions, they should also be listed in the job description. Farming can be really dirty. Let's face it. Whether you're in a chicken house or in the field, cultivating or on equipment. It could be hot, it could be dirty. So make sure that's listed within the job description. And to the right, I have a graphic here. And in the middle, we have our job description. And then around the middle, we have our different qualifications that are needed within the job. So, roles and duties, you would list that within the job description. Organizational goals, what does the business need this new employer to do? As far as reach our objectives and generating sales revenue and hopefully be profitable. Educational qualifications, skills needed, and then salary range. So those are like the core things to remember when you're building out a job description for new farm labor. So we're gonna go into tax considerations for hiring. I think the one thing we're thinking about hiring employees on a farm, right? The first thing you should ask yourself is, do I need, when I pay for some work on this operation, do I need to bring them on as a waged employee? Or can I pay them as a 1099 employee, as a contractor? Because a lot of times, farmers only need a 1099 employee. They don't need to bring somebody on and, undergo paying them a wage rate. So, and then also, when you do that, trying to retain that employee is just difficult. It's difficult to do in rural communities. Whether, it's a farming business, seed business, whatever it is, it's hard to retain effective employee in rural communities. So I think the first thing to ask yourself, once you identify your labor need or whatever it is, can I pay somebody as a 1099 employee? Is my labor demand, 3 months out of the year, 6 months out of the year? Do I need to pay this person throughout the year? Or can I get away with, them being a 1099 employee? I underline this because I think it's really important. Make sure to talk to an accountant before you offer any benefits to any employees. And we're gonna talk about health insurance and retirement in the coming weeks. But if you're considering offering that, to an employee on the farm, whether it's a family member, whoever it might be, definitely talk to an accountant because there are some tax benefits to doing that. But the taxes, they vary from business structure to business structure. So that's really, really important. And then last but not least, remember how business structures are taxed and how, bringing somebody on board and paying their wages is going to impact the taxes. So on the next slide, we have a table. We have the farm business entities most commonly seen. So LLCs, C corporation, S corporation, a partnership, and a sole proprietorship. I'm not going to go through this, in complete detail because we could talk about farm taxes, in a 3 or 4 hour course. And, the limited liability company, they can file as a C corporation, S corporation, partnership, or sole proprietorship. So, limited liability company, you can file depending on what business structure, other business structure entity you want to file as. But the tax return type for the C corporation is 1120, is Form 1120. For the S corporation, it's Form 1120S. Partnership, Form 1065. And then sole proprietorship would be a Form 1040 or Schedule F. So then, that's how the taxes would be affected when you bring in a new employee. So we have, owner wages, dividends, and distributions, and then income tax as well. This will be, we'll include this when we mail this to you guys at the end of the program. But just kind of want to revisit that briefly and just think about that as far as your operation goes and when you bring on a new employee. Really, honestly, the biggest thing about taxes, once you've sat down and you've talked to your accountant, that you're planning on bringing on a new employee as a full-time wage rate person, not as a contractor. Now you need to understand that you're handling taxes. That's your responsibility now as the employer. So you need to make sure that you withhold any, income taxes, Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, from the wages that you paid to this new employee. Payroll now also becomes, for lack of a better word, your problem. You're going to need to adjust that to the new employee's income. You have to look at the withholdings, potential benefits, if offered. So you're going to have to adjust the payroll, if they do enroll benefits, which we'll talk about in later weeks. New employees, you're going to have to get a W-4 from them. That include their filing status and it determines if, what they are going to need to withhold towards their taxes. So that's going to have to be reflected with the payroll. There's just a lot of tax considerations to consider when you're bringing on a farm employee full time. So make sure you consider that if you're thinking about, hiring or, retaining an employee. Some of you guys may already see this. if you have farm employees, but just definitely want to revisit that in this program. So orientation employee training, let's say you go ahead, you had the greatest job description in the world, you found the ideal candidate, you made them an offer, and they've decided to come work for you. You definitely need to consider having an orientation process and employee training for the new employee in the farming operation. Now, I'm gonna kind of go through some more detail on a personal note. My wife, she grew up on a cattle farm in southern New Jersey. When we were dating, I went out to the farm, there, her grandfather, he said, hey, you're gonna work with me when you come out here. I said, all right, sounds good. And there was no orientation, there was no training, and I really felt like I was running around the times I spent with him on his farm like a chicken without a head. I had no idea what was going on, going a million miles an hour. Looking back at it, I wish we had some kind of, I don't know if he'd want to spend all the time on orientation or employee training or whatever, process there, because he'd just pay me cash, but, the boyfriend of her granddaughter here, not seeing him all the time, but, definitely like looking back at it now, some of the things he asked me to do, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really grow up around like cattle farming as well, so I kind of was a little bit clueless on some of the stuff. But you definitely, if you're planning on bringing somebody on payroll and, doing the taxes and all that stuff, you definitely need to consider having orientation employee training. Make sure that, that they don't get hurt on the farm because, you're expecting them to do something that they're not familiar with. That's the one thing you want to try to mitigate. But new employee onboarding should really contain, the following, background and overview of the operation, employee policies. Paul's going to talk to you guys about that a little bit later, by like employee handbook, introductions, and then job duty information. So we're going to cover all these in more detail. So background overview of the operation, the employees need to understand the operation, where they can find different equipment, different tools, wherever it is, they need to understand where things are located and how the organization works. They need to know the organizational chart of the operation, so I included that in the right, they need to know who the owner of the business is, who they're reporting to every day. If they have an issue who they need to talk to and go ahead and report a problem to, they need to understand that organizational chart. I kind of mentioned earlier, they need to know where things are at on the operation. I would suggest possibly offering a tour of the operation, so show them individual fields. If you're doing produce, maybe a packing facility, showing them how machines work. You don't want anybody getting hurt on the job because they haven't had particular training in operating some of this specialized equipment. Show them the milk parlor. You just show them how to operate things on the operation and where they can find them. The employee, they should definitely see as far as, the whole scope of the operation, how their role is going to contribute to the overall farm success. And a lot of times, like, things have really changed in the labor market the last, 10, 15, 20 years. The workplace culture is becoming more important, not just for farming businesses, but all businesses across the country. So they definitely need to feel that they belong in the farm, and that you bringing them on as a new employee is going to benefit the operation. They can see that, okay, now I'm an integral part of this operation. Oh, I went backwards. Gotta go forward. So employee policies, I talked about this a little bit. I would definitely consider developing an employee policy handbook. I worked an internship in the past with Mount Air Farms. It's a really large poultry integrator here on the Eastern Shore. While there, they gave us this pretty comprehensive employee policy handbook, and you don't need to develop anything. You don't need to develop them, 700-page book like that. Just something that expresses, the different policies that you have on the farm. You might want to talk about, drug policy. Some states have legalized, marijuana, so you may not want your employees partaking in that on the business. Same with alcohol. So make sure that those, your policies on that are written within a handbook. and express the handbook during orientation. So explain the different policies and procedures and why that's the case, why these policies exist. So that way, if there is a problem with an employee, you can go ahead, you can discuss the handbook and discuss the orientation, what was discussed. Introductions, this should also be part of the orientation process. But employees, they need to know who their coworkers are and what they do. And really, this really sets them up for success. If there's an issue with, a fellow coworker or, supervisor or whatever it is, if they know who they could talk to, it really sets them up for long-term success on the farm. Meeting coworkers in person, I think is really integral, especially on like in a farming business. I know that, since COVID, we do a lot of virtual stuff. I wouldn't suggest doing this as far as bringing on, a farm employee to the operation. Definitely try to have an in-person, face-to-face, initial one-on-one meeting. So definitely try to incorporate the in-person meeting if possible. So job duty information, this is something you also want to cover during orientation. But you use that, hopefully you use that excellent, great, perfect job description in the pre-employment phase when you're searching for the ideal new candidate for the position. But you definitely want to revisit the job description during new employee orientation and try to highlight that and how it ties into the different things we've discussed in the orientation process. So definitely, reflect that when you're bringing on these new employees. Emphasize, I can't stress this enough. Farming can be a very dangerous business, whether you're operating machinery. I think actually working cattle is actually one of the, working with livestock, particularly cattle, is a very dangerous profession. So definitely emphasize basic safety within the operation, and try to stress that. You can't stress it enough, honestly. But make sure that during the onboarding process, you're talking about how safety is important to the operation. Assist employees understand the relationships, the relationship and importance of the position to the other jobs and functions of the farm. Make sure that they feel like they have a sense of belonging, that what they're doing is important to the operation. Go back to my wife's grandfather. I was just dating the granddaughter of the farmer pretty much. And I don't really know exactly what he kind of saw in me with that, but I would dare to say that the title of my position or the job description there would be, I'm going to make him do whatever I need him to do to give him approval for my granddaughter. So don't do that with your new employees. So we're going to finish up on employee communication. Employee communication, this is really, it takes many shapes and forms. But essentially, the sharing of information and ideas between a manager and an employee, just make sure I didn't get ahead of myself. But there are some key tips, to improve employee communication, because sometimes farming is just a lot of things can happen and a lot of things can happen quickly. So here's some key tips. Try to meet regularly with employees, make sure whether it's a one-on-one or, as a group, try to get feedback on different things that they're seeing every day within the farming operation. Try to see them regularly. Sometimes, you might have somebody that's going out, you send them in a tractor to a field to go cultivate, depending on acreage and what you're producing, you may not see them for, a whole week. They might be in a tractor for the week. So try to at least see them, employees on the farm on a weekly basis at the minimum. Be positive, farming, a lot of things that happen quickly. Try to be as positive as possible when you're talking to employees. Use different communication tools. Not everybody, especially in the modern day and age, not everybody likes one-on-one time and conversation. You might be best using like a cell phone, texting, email. Email's not as direct, but try to use different communication tools. Be clear and concise with your expectations. If you want them to pick, 30 bushels of, tomatoes, whatever it is, make sure that you're clear about it and that there's nothing being left out. The employee needs to know exactly what your expectations are. Provide feedback to them, if it's positive feedback, try to highlight that. But make sure you're providing feedback to your employees. If you have an employee that has an issue, make sure that you're trying to implement an open door policy. Let them be able to come in and get a hold of you about any issues that they might have. You don't want to be an employer that's, I'm trying to think of a term. You don't want to make it hard for an employee to come up and speak with you about an issue. So trying to be as open as possible about, talking to your employees. And then last but not least, understand communication differences exist. I'm different than somebody else. I was different than my wife's grandfather and how we spoke to each other. Some of the things I said to him, he probably didn't like. And some of the things that he said to me, I didn't like. But you definitely need to understand that communication differences exist. So, consider that when you're talking to employees. So kind of touched on this already, but really the thing to highlight is, if you don't have effective employee communication, your managers, you can't lead employees properly and effectively. You can't have an effective business, and effective employees accomplishing the tasks. So make sure that you have good employee communication. Think about a strategy for this as well. I don't know if you really need to go out and develop a employee communication, write out like a standard operating procedure for this or not. Maybe that's something you can consider if you have a lot of employees. But definitely think about a strategy to go ahead and communicate expectations to employees. And really the key here is, I can't stress this enough, make sure that you have positive communication between managers and employees. Because really, at the end of the day, when you're doing those annual reviews or you're reviewing employee, it makes objectives and expectations clear. So it's really important to make sure that it's, there's some positive communication. So we're gonna go ahead and finish up. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I think I see something in the chat. Oh, Kristen put in the webinar. So definitely, I don't know how we want to handle. I don't think you guys gave us mailing addresses when you registered, but we will, maybe in the coming weeks, we'll collect your guys' mailing information so we can get you these materials. Any questions at all about what we covered here in the last hour? Any discussions maybe about, I don't know, maybe your labor needs on the farm?
Hi, this is Brooke Turner. I do have a question. Regarding all of the employee handbooks and job descriptions and everything that was discussed today, would you, and this might be one of those questions where the answer is seek legal counsel, would you suggest having the employees sign those documents and dating them so that way if there's ever any miscommunication or any issues down the line, you can say, okay, well, you signed this document on this day, so it was clearly communicated to you in X, Y, and Z.
So my opinion is yes. I would definitely have the employees sign the handbook or some kind of acknowledgement that they've read the materials and that they've reviewed them. I was looking to see if Paul was still in the chat because he is a legal specialist with the University of Maryland. He's gonna cover the employee handbook, like the legal side of it, in more detail in the coming weeks. But for me, I would definitely have him sign that because then it's binding that we've both gone through it and looked through it and we acknowledge what's within the handbook.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So you talked about like talking to your accountant before you offer any benefits for employees. Is there certain benefits that employees are looking for more than others? If that makes sense?
I think it really depends on the industry itself and what the job is. So like truck drivers, they might be looking for benefits that their counterparts have within the same, within the same position. So they might be looking for, health insurance or and retirement. It just really depends on the position. You don't always have to offer benefits. We're gonna talk about the next few weeks as well. Why is there a certain benefit that you've seen or you've heard? Are there benefits, I guess, in your, because you're from the cattle industry, right?
Correct, yes.
Are there certain benefits offered in your industry?
I probably depends on your job title, if it's, long-term disability versus retirement versus, I was just curious, if there was ones that maybe you should look at offering ahead of others that might be make the job more enticing.
The other thing too is remember how it's gonna impact your employees' wages.
Right.
So they're gonna have to pay into that. It would be great to have everybody with, a beautiful retirement plan and, full benefits and all that, but at the end of the day, oh, can they pay their bills?
Right.
It's gonna really vary from operation to operation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So this is Maria, and I'm one of the folks on the team here who really help look at the retirement and healthcare benefits. And, as I was doing that, I was really looking at what is the research saying? What are the trends? And especially for younger folks who are entering into fields, benefits are really important, and they're making the decision to take jobs that offer benefits versus, jobs that don't offer benefits. So that's one of the reasons why we've included retirement and healthcare, kind of understanding what the options are for small businesses, farm businesses. So as Nate said, we're going to be talking a little bit about that in the next couple of weeks. Next week is Paul, and he's going to be talking about kind of the legal aspects of things when hiring and managing labor. And then the next week we'll be talking about healthcare and health insurance, and the following week we'll be focusing on that retirement planning and saving. But overall, people are looking for that kind of support because it is expensive, and it's an important aspect to well-being, really, in the short term and the long term. So I think folks are looking for that.
And maybe you'll answer this in the coming weeks too, but are you seeing that, if it's a higher wage versus maybe a little bit of a lower wage plus benefits, is there a way that employees are looking at those jobs? Like, are they choosing one or the other over the other?
That's a good question. I think some of it has to do with where that person is in their lifespan, right? But I think ultimately many organizations kind of do that, choosing to pay a little bit of a lower wage in order to offer the benefits. And employees recognize the benefit of that, because then there's cost sharing between the employer and the employee to provide those benefits. And so they recognize that as that's less income they need to have in order to do, what they to access those resources. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
And I would say too, going back to the job description, potential employees, they're gonna look and see what benefits are offered, if any, for similar jobs within the employment area. So they're gonna go ahead and take a look. So that's something you definitely, need to consider when you're going out and trying to recruit somebody. If you're hiring an agronomist per se, or hiring, I don't know, a truck driver, I keep using that example today. But if you're hiring that position, you need to go and see people with that same title within your employment area. Do they have benefits or not? Because, if they're offering that, you may not find the ideal candidate.
Yeah, that
I-
makes sense.
I would also circle back around to what Nate was saying is, are you looking for a full-time person versus somebody that's seasonal? And so, keeping somebody full-time may warrant offering benefits. Whereas if it's a seasonal person and you can kind of do it on a contract basis, then that may be a better route for that kind of position.
Any other questions or discussions? Well, hey, we're looking forward to going on this journey with you guys the next couple weeks. In the chat, we have a survey for you guys to fill out for us today. Please do that. And if you guys have any other questions or anything, feel free to email me. I'm gonna put in if you have any like particular questions outside of the group, I'm gonna go ahead and put in my contact information within the chat. Thank you, guys.
Nice job, Nate.